This monologue comes from my play, The Lovers and Others of Eugene O'Neill. And I wrote it as a one-woman play, but it actually can be used by many people. There are many monologues of the different predominant women in his life. And there are several of these monologues in the volume 2 of this anthology, but I thought I would pick Agnes Bolton, his second wife, because it is the shortest. Not quite as poetic, perhaps, but the shortest. And she was the second wife. She was the mother of 2 of his 3 children, including Una O'Neill, who later married Charlie Chaplin, some of you may know, and I think he immediately disowned her. I think he disowned all his children, actually. So he was quite a character, and she's going to tell it to you like it is. Well, here I am, Agnes Bolton, the wife who failed the great Eugene O'Neill. You know, it took me many years to realize that our failed marriage was not entirely my fault, if indeed it was my fault at all. No, I think that Jean and I would have parted company with or without Carlotta in the picture. Let's see, what can I tell you about him? I mean, that is why you've stayed on here, isn't it? I guess I could start with the first time I met Eugene O'Neill. It was at a little bar in the West Village, the Hell Hole, I think it was called, on Bleecker Street. And we all knew him, sort of, I mean, by sight. But on this particular evening, he walks in and he sits down at my table and begins to stare at me for the longest time. Well, I was young enough to feel flattered. I mean, I thought he was intoxicated with my very presence, until I realized that he was not staring at me, but at his own reflection in the mirror directly behind me. So I said, Mr. O'Neill, why are you staring at yourself? I mean, people are going to think you're conceited. To which he vigorously replied, I am not conceited. I stare at myself to make sure I'm still there. Well, it was always my candid remarks that would get me into trouble with Jean. He hated having anyone question his well-rehearsed public persona, you know, the poet, the playwright. As a matter of fact, I honestly can say I don't think he liked me very much. He was jealous. Oh yes, he was. He could grow jealous just watching me smoke. He was jealous of the fact that I too was a writer, with an ego and a personality of my own. He hated my innocence, my joie de vivre, my human fallibility, and quite often, he would strike out at me with his fists. His rage would strike out at my vulnerability. I think that my vulnerability reminded him of his own. He was in love with his own tragic concept of life, so you mustn't pity him. He loved being tortured, and I cannot think of a more supreme torture than for him to have married Carlotta, the actress, although it did take me a little bit by surprise. I mean, after all, just between you and me, Carlotta was no intellectual genius. But I thought, you know, I thought he'd grow tired of her after a while. But apparently his need for a mother and a caretaker far outweighed his desire for a lover and an intellectual companion. Don't get me wrong, we did have our good times. Right, Jean? Our good times, lying on the beach, watching the seagulls drifting overhead. Jean used to imagine himself a seagull, free from domestic care and responsibility. But of course, inevitably, one of my irreverent remarks would bring him tumbling back down to earth again. Gene, I'd say, you know, even seagulls eventually have to land. You know, dirty diapers, children's vomit on the back seat. That is the one thing I will never forgive him for. The way he treated our children. It would have been better if he had abandoned them altogether. But for some reason, he loved holding power over them, even from a distance. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't please him. No one could please him. So I certainly couldn't please him, so I gave my artist husband the freedom he so desperately needed, the illusion of freedom so often maintained by the male sex. And what does he do with it? He walks right through the open door and into captivity, into the waiting arms of Carlotta, his beloved jailer. Well, I'm sorry, Gene, but I do believe in telling it just the way it is. You know that, don't you? Don't you? Yes. I knew him better than anyone, really. I knew him better